Hello, and welcome to the course. I'm your host today, Martha Marion, and I'm speaking with Professor Michele Friedner, a medical anthropologist and associate professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development, whose work explores social, moral, religious, and economic practices in deaf and disabled communities with a focus on deafness in India. She is the 2023 recipient of the Rachel Carson Prize by the Society for the Social Studies of Science, as well as a published scholar, including the 2015 book, Valuing Deaf Worlds in Urban India. She's here to talk about her career path and how she became a University of Chicago professor. Welcome to the course, Professor Friedner. Michele, will you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Michele Friedner, and as you said, I'm a medical anthropologist, and I teach at the University of Chicago in an interdisciplinary social science department called Comparative Human Development. And our department is really unique in the sense that we have anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, and linguists, as well as behavioral biologists, who are all interested in thinking broadly about development of humans and non-human animals in context.
Wow, I have many questions about this, and it sounds like the interdisciplinary nature sounds pretty thrilling, and I'm sure you're having not only interesting conversations, but doing such expansive work with all of those folks. But let's go back to the beginning. I would love to know the origin story. This is where we know you are now, but how did your interest in this field begin for you, and when was that?
So I grew up in Queens in New York. Queens is one of the boroughs, and it's the most diverse borough in many ways. And when I was growing up in Queens, most of my friends and playmates in elementary school and before elementary school were from Kerala in India. Kerala is the southernmost state in India, and I hung out with Kerala folks and with people from elsewhere in India. And when I went to college, I decided to study religious studies, and I focused mostly on Indian religions. And it was super interesting because I just somehow stumbled upon an Indian religions class in my first year of my freshman year of college. And I had this amazing professor who I still kept in touch with, even when I was in graduate school and beyond. And she started our first class by saying that she was going to teach us how to see things differently and how to think differently about the world. And she wanted us to go out every night and look for the rabbit in the moon. So I would do that, and I would force myself to see the rabbit in the moon. And that class, this Intro to Indian Religions class, was just such a revolutionary class to me, and it really changed how I saw the world and how I thought about things like religion and about relationships with humans and non-humans. And so I took that class, and then I decided to major in religious studies. And those of us who study religious studies often joke that we had a new religion every semester. And we got to experience and learn about so many different religions. And so this was at Brown University. And the religious studies department, I think, was a really warm and cozy department. It was really supportive, and we had professors who were really into also doing experiential teaching with us. So one of my professors was a Zen Buddhist monk, and he had us do meditations, both walking meditations and meditations in pairs, and he also took us on field trips. And so that's why I say we've gained an experiential understanding of different religions.
And how, sort of at that time, that's a very influential time of life anyway. How did you notice yourself, your personality, your worldview expanding and changing? Can you give me an example of that?
Yes. So what's interesting is, I grew up in Queens in New York, as I said, and neither of my parents had gone to college away from home. Actually, that's not true because my father had immigrated to the U.S., but I was the first person in my family to go away for college and to attend an elite school like Brown University. And so I was surrounded by people who were very different from me, which is not to say I wasn't surrounded by people who were different from me when I was growing up, especially in Queens. But, in terms of thinking about class and race, and religion, these were not things that were deliberately foregrounded and talked about so explicitly when I was growing up. And then I got to college, and all of a sudden these are things that we are talking about and thinking about and working hard to make sense of. And so it was a pretty profound event in my life. I mean, it was a profound period in my life to attend this university. I mean, to live away from home, to attend this university, to meet all kinds of people, to learn about different political movements, and to also learn about different religions.
And at that point, as a religious studies major, what were your ideas around what you might maybe wanted to do with that at that time? What did you think? Where did you think that was going to lead you?
So I think my freshman year and sophomore year, I had no idea what I would want to do. I know my father really wanted me to go to law school. He had a sense that I should become a lawyer and I would become settled and it would be a secure future. And I was ambivalent about that. And actually, after taking a few Indian religions classes, so the other thing that I did in college was between my freshman year and sophomore year, I did a program called Summer Bridge, which is an AmeriCorps program which sends college students into different communities to teach in the summer. And I went to do this in Portland, Oregon. And I wound up staying with the family of another Brown University student who was a few years ahead of me. And her family was from Bangalore in India. And they were Indian. And I loved staying with them. And I learned more about different kinds of Indian cultures and cuisines and ways of being in the world. And so that further developed my interest in going to India. And so I had asked my parents if I could study abroad. No, sorry, that's not true. I had asked my parents if I could take time off of school to go to India. And they said no, that they wouldn't allow me to do that. And so then in my junior year, I really wanted to study abroad in India. But at that time, there were not very many study abroad programs. And then the other thing that was a consideration for me was because I'm deaf and use real-time captioning in my classes, my family was concerned about the Americans with Disabilities Act and its portability in other countries and about whether there would be accommodations in other programs abroad. And so we basically decided that I shouldn't say we, they decided that going to India would not be a feasible option. And
you're like, I would have decided something different.
Yeah, I would have decided something different. Yes. And so what happened was I wound up going to Oxford University for a year because for study abroad programs, Oxford University is based on the tutorial system, and you basically have these very individualized tutorials with you and an instructor, and you're reading texts and talking about them and writing essays each week. So it was the kind of situation where accommodations would not be needed for me because it would be one-on-one. And so we decided that I would do that. And so when I went to Oxford, I continued to study things related to India as well. And that was also my first experience, working with postdocs and lecturers in this one-on-one way. And I was like, oh, this is an interesting potential career path. This could be something that would be really exciting and stimulating and fun. But I don't think I seriously thought about becoming a professor at that time. I think I just really enjoyed working with
I like the world that I'm in. Yeah. And what were you specifically studying in those one-on-one experiences?
So I did a course on Islamic jurisprudence, which was, I think, the best class for me that I did. And then I did a class on oral traditions And I did a class on, I think it was on Indian religion, and I did one on Judaic studies. And there were these really wonderfully tailored classes where I would go in, I would meet with the lecturer, and we would talk about, what would be interesting things to read. And then I would go to the library and read them. And then I would write an essay, and then I would go and talk to them about my essay and talk to them about the reading. And then I would go and do it again.
I mean, that sounds pretty wonderful. Like,
It
that sounds
was.
pretty stimulating. And I mean, I'm a big school nerd anyway. So I'm like, that sounds wonderful to me. But so you were there for one semester or a year?
I was there for a year, and I will say that academically, it was really wonderful and stimulating, but socially, I had a super hard time because Oxford, I think, is a very elite place, and there's a strong sense of exceptionalism about itself. And it's also a place that I think is socially pretty hard to break into. Like, there are eating clubs. Well, not eating clubs, but there are, you would have to wear a gown to go to meals in the dining hall, and people would go to the pub together. And so, so it was just kind of a weird place for me socially. And so stimulating academically, but socially weird.
Yeah. How did you, thinking with an eye towards anyone who might be listening to this episode, how did you sort of internally work through that challenge of feeling stimulated in one way, but pretty isolated or, challenged in a different way? How did you move through that moment?
Well, I tried to leave whenever I could. So on the weekends, I would go to London or I would travel elsewhere. And then I think I would just devote myself to my work. And I spent countless hours in the library and really just focused on that.
Yeah. And then, did you come back to Brown for your senior year after that?
I came back to Brown for my senior year. And then after I graduated from Brown, I taught for 1 year at a private independent school for kids with, at that time they were called diverse learners, or kids with different learning styles. So it was a small independent school for kids who did not fit into sort of traditional or normative public schools or private schools. So it was a super small school. And I did that for 1 year. And then after that, I went and I worked for a law firm. So I thought, okay, fine, I will try it out.
Here you go, Dad. This one's for you.
Yeah. So I did that, and I worked mostly on deaf access related issues. So I was working for, it was a national nonprofit law firm that focused on doing mostly large-scale class action lawsuits on behalf of disabled people. And I worked on a lot of cases involving deaf access violations and discrimination against deaf people. And then during that time, I was like, okay, I'm going to save my money, and I'm going to finally get to go to India.
Yes,
and
yes.
so I
want to hear about this.
So I saved my money, and then I planned to go to India. And then what I did was I planned to visit different disability and deaf organizations in India. So when I landed, and I should note that I traveled with my then person I was dating and now partner, we started off at the Aliyava Jung National Institute for the Hearing Handicapped in Mumbai. So that was the first place that we went. And when we were there, we met Sibaji Panda, who was one of the leaders of India's deaf rights movement, and he has been really instrumental in starting Indian Sign Language curricula and influencing and advocating for the spread of Indian Sign Language teaching around the country. So we started out there, and then we went to visit
it seems like India had been calling you for so long. What was it like to finally arrive in Mumbai?
Well, it was quite overwhelming when we first got there because the Aliyava Jung Institute is located in the middle of a pretty large slum area in Bandra. It's very densely populated. So when we first got there, I think we were sort of reeling from the heat and from the chaos, but we were also really grateful to have been warmly welcomed onto this relatively calm residential campus.
Yeah.
And I didn't know at that time that that would be a place that I would go back to again in the future. So that was interesting. And we were taken care of so lovingly by the people that we met, who showed us around, who took us to meals, who took us to see sites, and so on.
Yeah. So how does this trip, is this trip, it sounds like it's pretty instrumental in sort of bringing together these things you've been doing, right? The religious aspect, the India aspect, and now you're working sort of more specifically in the field of deaf rights and disability rights. How does this start to coalesce into a career path?
Well, I think I spent lots of time while I was in India being very curious about the ways that discourses, what people were saying around deaf rights and the importance of Indian Sign Language and the importance of advocacy, they seem very similar to what I had heard in the U.S. when I was working in legal spaces and participating in deaf and disability advocacy in the U.S. And so after this trip, which was pretty short, it was a little bit over 2 months, I thought, you know what, I really want to study this further. And I was trying to think about how I might be able to do that. And I had originally thought that I might want to study public health, but then I talked with Sue Schwake, who was at that time an English professor at UC Berkeley. And she said, you know what you're describing sounds like medical anthropology. And you should really look at Berkeley's medical anthropology program. We have amazing scholars like Lawrence Cohen and Nancy Shepherd-Hughes. And so I started to read Lawrence's book, which was about aging in India and ideas of what it means to age well and what it means to age both biomedically and within a family. And, you know, just like how do we think about aging more broadly? And I thought, wow, this is an amazing book. And this is very similar to what I want to do in terms of thinking about deafness and disability in India. And since I was in the Bay Area, it was really easy to contact Lawrence and Nancy and other people at Berkeley. And so what I did, which is probably good advice for people thinking about grad school, was I actually just went to their offices and signed up for office hours and stood outside their offices and waited patiently until they had a moment. And then I introduced myself and told them about my research interests. And then I applied to grad school, and thankfully and luckily, I got into Berkeley UCSF, and I chose to go there and focus on, again, medical anthropology with relation to disability and deafness.
And for those of us who may or are not in the field, could you just give us a definition of medical anthropology as a field?
So traditionally, historically, medical anthropology has looked at medicine as a cultural system. So when we think about doctors wearing their white coats and following, you know, certain spoken and unspoken rules of the field, medical anthropologists look at that critically and study it just as they would study other cultures or communities or worlds. However, more recently, medical anthropologists have looked beyond the clinic to looking at other spaces that could be considered medicalized spaces or not medicalized spaces. And we have looked at the hegemony of biomedicine. We've looked at the ways that people's lived experiences of illness have been valued and devalued. And we've looked at questions of power and development in medicine and beyond. And I will say really quickly that, you know, medical anthropology might seem a problematic space to do work on disability because of disabled people's fraught relationship with medicine. But I've always found it a really inspiring and important space to do work on disability because medical discourses are so prevalent in how we think about disability.
Yeah. And I mean, you speak with such clarity and also such passion about this, and we'll eventually get to how this leads you to the University of Chicago. But I would love to hear, if you were trying to explain to someone in 5 minutes why you are passionate about this field and why it is important and what we what you want us to know, the people who will not be in this field professionally. What is your mission statement? What do you want? What change do you wish to affect in the world?
So I think, again, as somebody who works at the intersection of disability studies and medical anthropology, I think something that I'm really passionate about is the fact that medicine's perspectives or doctors' perspectives of the experiences of disabled people are heavily deficit-based. And we have studies that show that disabled people routinely value their lives and rate their quality of life higher than doctors do. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And I think, for me in my work, I always try to take a strength-based perspective to thinking about disability, and I look at disabled people as experts in how they move through the world and how they utilize disability expertise in worlds that are not designed for them. So I think in my work, I always try to foreground disabled people's perspectives and to show the important and often courageous work that they do to create inhabitable worlds, and that they're often doing this despite medicine, and despite educational infrastructures and systems that don't exist to make things easy for them. So I think that's what I would say. And I would also say, of course, there are doctors that are amazing when it comes to disability. I was just in India, and I was talking with a orthopedic surgeon as well as his patient, and he was really incredible in terms of how he thought about disability holistically, in terms of how he was an advocate for his patients, and in terms of how he works really hard to work not only with the individual patient, but to think about systemic issues in medicine and in society. And so I really valued that. And I think that that's super important for doctors and other medical practitioners to do. Like, they need to think beyond the individual patient and to think about the ableist structures that surround the institutions and the world in general in which we live.
I am over here just like vociferously nodding my head with everything you say, but that was also beautifully put. So how does all of this, as it's all coalescing, you finish up at your graduate education, how does this lead you to walk in the doors eventually of University of Chicago as a professor?
So after I graduated from Berkeley, I had a postdoc at MIT for 3 years, and I was in the anthropology program there, where I had incredible mentors who really supported me in finishing my first book, which was on the experiences of sign language speaking adults, and mostly in Bangalore in South India. So I had that postdoc for 3 years, and then I went and I got a job. I was lucky. By the way, I applied for hundreds of jobs. It is not easy to get an academic job.
Which I think is important to note for the listeners of this podcast.
Yes, I think it's super important to know. And I should say that when I started my PhD, I had no idea that the job market was going to be what it is. I had no idea. And I wasn't even thinking. And, now I look at my students, my undergraduate students at UChicago, and I do have students who say, oh, I'm going to be a professor when I graduate, and I'm going to finish my BA, and then I'm going to do a PhD, and then I'm going to become a professor. And I listen to these students who are relatively confident about this, and I really don't understand it because it is such a difficult path, and there are so few jobs, and I think the structure of higher education is changing, and so I count myself as being incredibly lucky. So after I finished my postdoc, I got a job at Stony Brook University, which is a SUNY in New York, and a state university of New York, and I was teaching it was a new PhD program in rehabilitation sciences, and there was a disability studies track in that program. And so I was teaching in that program, and I had wonderful colleagues and mentors and students. However, I had always heard about this program, the Department of Comparative Human Development, this department, and I had applied for a job here when I was finishing up my postdoc. And I think I made it to the first round of elimination. So I applied, and then what they do is so you apply, and then they maybe weed out, hundreds of applications, and then they ask people for letters of recommendation. And so I got to that stage. I submitted my letters of recommendation, and then it never progressed further. But, this department was always in the back of my mind as my dream department. And so I was teaching in New York at Stony Brook when a job in this department opened. And so I thought, you know what? Even though we love living in New York, and even though it's great to be at a state university like Stony Brook, and even though it's great to be working with these students, I would really love this job. And so I applied for this job, and then I was asked the letters, and then I was invited for an interview, and then I came out for an interview, and I gave a job talk, which is, for those of you who don't know, when you are doing the academic job market thing. So you are invited for a campus visit, which is essentially a series of interviews and a job talk. And these things are scheduled back to back over 2 to 3 days. And it's an incredibly grueling process where you're just constantly in meetings, and then you have your job talk, and then you get grilled, often in very productive but difficult ways. And then you have dinners. And so it's a really arduous and grueling process. But anyway, so I went through that, and then it took a really, really long time to find out that I had been hired because there were budget cuts, and then it seems like it was unclear whether they were going to get to hire for the position or not. And then I finally got the offer, but it came really late in the academic year. And so at that point, it made more sense to stay at Stony Brook for another year out of courtesy to my department and just in terms of my family. And so I stayed in New York for another year, and then we moved to Chicago to join the department.
And when was that? How long have you been there? How long have you been at U of Chicago?
So this is my 7th year. I got tenure 2 years ago. When I joined, thank you. When I joined as a second term assistant professor. And then I had, I think, 5 years to get tenure. And so during that time, I wrote a second book, and I published a bunch of articles, and I got a grant from the National Science Foundation.
Nice. And what is it like being in, you mentioned the uniqueness of this department. What is it like being in a department that is so intersectional and interdisciplinary?
I love it so much. So I have colleagues who are developmental psychologists who I will go to and ask questions about language development in small children. I have colleagues who are behavioral biologists who are asked about animal communication. I have linguistic colleagues who work at the intersection of language and, at the intersection of linguistic anthropology and other forms of anthropology. Oh, I shouldn't say that, but at the intersections of linguistic anthropology and more general anthropology, who I will ask linguistic anthropology questions. And it's a very collegial department. I think people really pride themselves on their commitment to being in this interdisciplinary space, and they pride themselves on being able to consult with colleagues and as well as to ask questions that go beyond individual disciplines. I'm so happy to be in this space where I don't feel confined to anthropology, and I feel like I'm challenged to think more broadly and also to write in ways that are more accessible to scholarly and lay communities. So I love it.
Beautiful. I mean, it sounds awesome.
It really is. It really, really is.
It really does sound that way. So as we start to close, I would love to know 2 things. One, this is sort of this is the time travel question. If you could go back, thinking about, when you described that first year of undergrad and you're expanding your worldview, if you could go back and talk to that version of yourself, what would you like her to know about this moment in your life and where your path has taken you? And what are you looking forward to in your own career as a professor and in the field moving forward?
So I think what I would like my earlier me to know is that it's possible to become an academic, and that becoming an academic is a career path that is an option, even though it is stressful and hard, especially in the beginning when you're not sure you're going to be able to get a job. So actually, that doesn't sound like a very good statement a very encouraging statement to my earlier self.
I think it sounds both encouraging and realistic, right? Like, this is a possibility, and have no illusions that it is, an easy or straight path.
Right. And I think I would tell my earlier self to continue to take classes that are exciting and interesting to you, because liberal arts education is incredible in that way. You have opportunities to study a wide range of things, and you don't know what will sit with you. Like I recently emailed a Russian lit professor that I had. I think I took her class in my first year of undergrad, and it was such an incredible class. Like, I still think about the Tolstoy novels that we read, and so I think I would validate that younger me that was interested in taking a lot of different kinds of classes. And I think I would also tell my younger me that you should take advantage of the possibility or the option of doing a research project as an undergrad. That's one thing that I see undergrads doing a lot at UChicago, independent and mentored research. And I think that would have been something that I would have loved doing as an undergrad, but I didn't. So I think independent and mentored research would be something to definitely consider doing as an undergrad student.
Beautiful. And finally, what's next? When you look forward in your own career path or the field itself, what are the things that are exciting right now?
Well, I really enjoy teaching and working with our students. So I'm looking forward to continuing to teach disability anthropology, and I teach a class on disability and design to students. And, it's interesting. We had this incredible quote. Actually, we didn't have it, but I think there was like a survey done on our department's courses at one point. And one of the students who took my disability and design class said, taking this class is like study abroad, because we learn a brand new way of thinking about the world, like thinking through disability expertise and thinking through questions of access has given me a totally different way of seeing the world. So, I really love teaching that class, and I teach it with Jennifer Iverson, who is a music theorist. And so it's really fun to teach with somebody who is very different from me in terms of discipline. And I love co-teaching with her. And so I'd like to continue to do that. And I think I like to continue to think about the role of disability in higher education, specifically as disability intersects with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure that disability is seen as a DEI issue. And then in terms of my research, I'm looking forward to continuing to conduct research in India and elsewhere in the world on issues of disability. I've been recently working on cochlear implantation and the ways that cochlear implantation has been changing how we see deafness societally and medically. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to work on that. Oh, and then one thing, I don't know if you did also want to mention this, but so neither of my parents are professors, right? And I don't have family members at all who are academics. And so I wonder if that would be useful for listeners to hear too, because I think so often it's an intergenerational thing. But there are lots of us out there.
Thank you, Professor Friedner, for your time today. And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the other ones. Leave us a comment, subscribe, follow, and share this episode with your friends and family. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. Stay tuned for more, and thanks for listening.